Welcome to Gever.com, where the wise get wiser. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the Hebrew vowels, and in particular, the E class or E type of vowel. We're also going to be reading and talking a little bit about two really important verses, one from Genesis chapter 17 and one from Psalm chapter 1. So, going to be really interesting. Well, let's go ahead and get wise. All right, well, let's talk about the Hebrew vowels a little bit more here. We're going to be looking at the E type of vowels. If you remember, we talked about the A type last time we talked about the Hebrew vowels. And in our next lesson that is focused on vowels, we will cover the remaining types. But today, we're just talking about the E vowels. Well, before we get into them, let's do just a quick review of our Hebrew alphabet. It's always helpful to just continue to remember and practice. So here we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. So that's our Hebrew alphabet. Well, let's talk about our vowels a little bit more again here. So as we've mentioned before, in Hebrew, our consonants are ancient and original, but the vowels were added much later on by scribes, rabbis, called the Masoretes in around 500 AD up until about 1000 or so AD. And as you can see here, they are typically added beneath our letters, though there are a few that we'll see that are placed a little bit differently. So let's look a little more closely at our E vowels. So there are three main types of E vowels, and then basically two other types or categories that are a little different. Okay, so we're going to classify these three types together as our more sort of strict E type or E class vowels. So the first one we have here on our right is called the Tsere. And as you see here, it's two little dots side by side in this horizontal pattern. So this is called the Tsere, directly beneath our letter. And then we have our Segol. And the Segol is three dots, kind of like a little triangle, but maybe upside down or something. So three dots, as you see here. Okay, Segol is three dots, Tsere is two dots, side by side. Now, this might get a little bit confusing and might even feel a little bit overwhelming. So I would definitely recommend practicing this and writing it out and making some notes, things like that. But I also, would say that with time, it'll be very familiar and not be too confusing. But got to practice. And then finally, we have here the Chataf Segol. And if you remember, that's kind of similar to our Chataf Patach, which is our reduced form. So you have this little double dot here, and then you have your Segol, as we see here. So it's this little double dot plus our triple dot from the Segol. Okay? And so those are our three primary E-type vowels. Well, we also have a type of vowel that is in the E class, but it's really more like the I in English, perhaps. But this might also be just a little bit confusing because it's technically not the I sound. All right, so this one is called the Hirik, and the other one is called the Hirik Yod. And that's because this Yod here is actually one of those matrolexiones forms that we talked about with the kamats, as in the kamats hey. All right. And then we have this last third category, if we will. And this one is that little double dot, but is vertical. And this one is called the shava or shawa, depending on who you talk to. I will refer to it typically as the shava. All right, so the shava is this little double dot, again, vertical. Now, this might feel a little bit tricky because the sere is 2 dots, but they're horizontal. And so the shava is 2 dots, but they are vertical. And as we saw in the chataf form, you actually have this shava plus the segol, as we see. All right, so let's look at how you write them just a little bit more closely and briefly. So the sere, again, is just 2 dots side by side, as you see here. So go ahead and take a piece of paper and a pen and notice that these dots are beneath our space. Okay, so our letter is written in our space and then the little vowels beneath it. Then we have our segol, again, 3 dots directly beneath it, below the space. And then we have our chataf segol or reduced segol. And again, these are directly beneath it, but it's 5 dots altogether. Now, what's interesting about these, and it's kind of similar as with our A vowels, as you'll notice, is that all 3 of them have the same sound. Eh. So the sere, the segol, and the chataf segol all sound the same. Eh. Now, just as a reminder, just like we talked about with the A vowels, this might feel a little bit weird or strange or redundant, but we kind of do a similar thing in English, but just the opposite. If you remember, in the A's, similar thing happened, but here with E, we also have one symbol, but many different sounds. So we have help, right? Eh. We have feet, eat. And then we have late, whereas the E is actually silent. We don't even pronounce it. We don't say leti or latte or something, right? It's just silent. So even in English, we have kind of an oddity or a strange relationship with our vowels in that we have one symbol that has many different sounds to it. And so for the Hebrew, it's sort of just the opposite. It's 3 symbols for one sound. And again, they are important because they give us different spellings. They can even give us completely different words. All right. So let's also mention here a little bit more of a complication to it. And that is the sere and the segol do also have a mater lectionis form as well. So as you notice here, we have the sere plus the yod and the segol plus the yod. And both of these actually have a little bit of a different sound. They sound like A. All right? A. So when you come across these mater lectionis forms, just remember that it's a little bit of a different sound. It's the segol yod with the A sound instead of eh. So A versus eh. Okay? So again, we have our 2 forms here give us the A sound. And in English, this might be equivalent to, say, like the word gray, or payton, right? Gray or payton. And so that's the sound that you get from both the sere yod and the segol yod. All right, well, let's talk now a little bit about the hirik. Well, the hirik, as you notice here, is just one single dot all by itself. I know, the loneliest letter. So this little dot here is directly beneath our letter and below the space. And similarly, we have a mater lectionis form for the hirik, and that's the hirik plus the yod, so hirik yod. Now, this one doesn't have any special or different sound to it. It's still just the same E sound that we get for the hirik. But again, just as a reminder, in ancient times, the yod would have been written, but this dot would not have because it didn't exist yet. It wasn't developed. But again, for whatever reason, whenever they developed the vowels, they decided to keep these materlecciones consonants as well, at least in a lot of cases. Though if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had way more of these materlecciones forms that do not appear in our Hebrew Bibles, and that's because for whatever reason the rabbis, scribes, did not find some of them to be original, or they did actually find them to be redundant. So there was at least some sense or some rhyme and reason to some of them being preserved. All right, so for our Heuric, again, the sound for the Heuric is the E sound, E. And that's why I want to keep it in this E class and not separate it out, because even though sometimes it will be called the I vowel, it's not like the I sound. In Hebrew, it's the E sound, as in two E's together, E, E. And so both of them have that same sound. And in English, again, it's a little bit tricky because you can actually have two different sounds, I or I. But typically, I don't even think you really have the E sound in English with the I vowel. But neither of these sounds are the sound for the Heuric in Hebrew, okay? So in Hebrew, the Heuric sounds like E, E, not like I or I. So you almost have to just kind of erase that from your memory somehow, that the Heuric is the E sound. All right, well, let's look finally here at the Shva. And as we already mentioned, the Shva is two dots vertical right below the letter, and beneath our space, two dots. And what's interesting about the Shva is that it actually has potentially two sounds, we might say. The really kind of the primary sense of the Shva is that there is no sound, that it's actually silent. And actually the word Shva means to be empty or, even futile. So it literally means, empty, no sound. But there are some times where it kind of carries the sense of like an E sound almost. And that's really just because whenever it's really what this is actually doing is it's actually telling you to just pronounce this letter, this consonant, distinctly or separately or uniquely. Okay, at least that's one of its kind of functions. And we'll talk about some of the different uses and functions of it later on in the grammar lessons. But for now, it generally means to kind of pronounce it independently. And so you have to kind of almost pronounce it with a sound. Now, in English, we do have some examples where it's sort of not really pronounced. Like we have gnat, right? So the G is basically almost silent. Now, that's not technically what it sounds like, but it's more like brand is oftentimes what it actually sounds like. So you could actually sound this out separately, right? Borand. But normally in English, we typically just say brand together. And that's kind of a little bit how the Shva also works. So it oftentimes will have kind of this joint sound to it, brand. And, just depending on how you say it, it might have a little bit more brand or just brand. Okay. But in either case, just remember that for the most part, this Shva is technically silent, though in some words, in some places, it might carry almost like an incidental sound to it because you got to pronounce the letter. All right. Well, let's go ahead and talk about a few key words with these E vowels. And the two that I have here are side by side because they are very easily confused. So we have, as you see here, the word L and the word L. So, of course, that could be very confusing. L and L. They sound the same, but as you'll notice, they do have different vowels, right? One is spelled with a segol and one is spelled with a sere. Now, this is very important because they are very different. L with the segol is actually the word to or towards, a preposition. And the word L with a sere is the word for God, as we've seen elsewhere, even with El Elohim, right? So it's important to distinguish those vowels because, that could, give you a different translation or interpretation even. Now, honestly, in most verses, you probably would never mistake the word to for God if you were understanding the context, because they're just used in such different ways. So that probably would never be confusing. But as we're learning, as we're getting started, and everything is kind of overwhelming and confusing and blurs together, I wanted to try to help kind of point these two out. And while we're on the topic, and I think we've talked about this just a little bit before, we have the two words Elohim and El. So, of course, El is our word for God, singular, and Elohim is our word for God, plural. So El and Elohim, God and gods. And it's important to note that both of these terms could be used for gods outside of Israel, right? Non-Yahweh gods. So this was just a term that meant God, divinity, something like that. And actually, you'll even see many names outside of Israel with the El added to them. So, of course, a name like Samuel, El, and many others like that have the El, God, added to it. And in some related languages and people groups outside of Israel, they also had the word El added to their names, sometimes with the form Il, because of the slight pronunciation difference in those languages. So it was kind of a generic term, just like it is for us in English. Elohim also could be used of gods, as in just many gods of the nations, but it could also be used more specifically and kind of uniquely, strangely even, for the one singular God of Israel. And as we've talked about this before, it probably either communicates his majesty or was used in the phrase El Elohim, meaning the God above all gods, or the greatest of all the gods. So one or the other, or perhaps both. All right, and then we have another two words side by side here that often are confused or confusing for folks. And that's the word Ben. So we've learned that word before, actually, Ben, and Ben means son. But then we also have the word Bane. So you notice that this is that sere plus the yod. So we have the sere by itself, which is Ben. But then we also have the mater lectionis form, which the sound changes just a little bit, right? It's a, Bane. So Ben and Bane. And one is son, Ben, and Bane means between. So oftentimes used in the sense of like, something between you and I, right? Either a covenant, a promise, or maybe a land or something like that. Something between two people. All right. Well, there's also two other words I want to compare here, and that's again just because they're maybe a little bit confusing as we're getting started. So we have this word again, Ben, with the sere, Ben, but you'll notice here we have B'nai. So this one has the shava plus the sere yod, a. So B'nai. So you notice how it's sort of B'nai, right? Rather than B'nai or something, or B'nai. It's B'nai. Kind of said together a little bit. So we have Ben and B'nai. And what's the difference? Well, Ben, with just the sere, is a son, singular, one son, a son. But B'nai actually means sons, so it's plural, sons of. So you'd say sons of David or sons of Israel, right? Sons of Jacob, whoever that is, okay? And it even gets kind of used generically to be just like either somebody from the type or class or the nation or, related to some place or something. So I wanted to also just bring this up because all three of these forms, Ben, Bain, B'nai, are very easily confused as you're getting started. Okay, so it would be really helpful for you to put all three of these probably on a single flashcard or write them out and kind of make sure your mind is square about them. Maybe figure out a little mnemonic device to kind of help you figure out and remember which one is which. Maybe like Bain is like Bain twain us or something. B'nai Yisrael is just a common phrase, so hopefully that becomes more familiar. Sons of Israel, B'nai Yisrael. But in any case, after a little while, a little practice, they will not be as confusing. So just stick with it and keep practicing. All right, well, let's go ahead and do some reading here. So we're going to be talking about Genesis 17. So let's go ahead and read these together. So we have here, Va'yehi Avram ben Tish'im. Va'yehi Avram ben Tish'im. Va'yehi Avram ben Tish'im. So we have here this word added to the front, and we also have seen this quite a few times as well. Yehi, which means it was, right? Or he was. And in this case, it actually has a subject, Avram, Abraham, or Abram in this case, since he hasn't got his name changed just yet. So, and Abraham was Ben. What does Ben mean? Ben means son. So Abraham was a son of Tish'im. Tish'im. And Tish'im is actually the word for 90. So that's kind of funny, isn't it? Abraham is called a son of 90. Now, 90 is, not somebody's name. It's not a people group or a place. It's, again, kind of this funny, unique way of referring to a category, a type. So as you can see, whenever you say somebody is a son of something, a son of, Israel, a son of, 90, whatever it is, and it can get used in a variety of ways. It's actually kind of categorizing them as related in some way to this category. So in this case, his age. All right, and then this finishes up here with that same phrase, shana, shana, which means year. So he was a son of 90 years, and then tesha shanim, tesha shanim. And again, we have and tesha, which is our word for 9, and then shanim, so years. So shana and shanim are the same word. This one is just plural. This one's singular. In ancient Hebrew, it's a little bit weird how they do numbers. This one is technically singular. This one's technically plural, even though it's 90 and 9. But it's a little odd, but that's how they did it. So we have that Abraham was the son of 90 years and 99 years, or 90 years and 9 years, or 99 years old. All right. Then we have here, Vayera Adonai El Avram. Avram. Vayera Adonai El Avram. So what do we have here? Well, we see that and word again, va. So and this is the word to like see or to look. We've seen this a couple other times in some other verses. So, and the Lord saw or looked El. Now we talked about this word just a little bit. All right, there's two variations, right? El and El. One means God and the other means to or towards. So God looked to Avram. And then we have Va Yomer Elav. Va Yomer Elav. Va Yomer Elav. Va Yomer Elav. And so what do we have here? We have and again. And then Yomer means to say or to speak. And then we have Elav. Elav. So, and he said to him. So this is actually that word meaning to or towards. Now, you'll notice here that this one actually has the sere. And so that might actually have tricked you or confused you to think like, oh, God said? Well, this is one of those kind of difficulties of Hebrew that will take a little time getting used to. But whenever something is added to the end of a word like this, so the word is originally El with a segel, but whenever you add something to a word on the end, it typically or often will change the vowels just a little bit. So I know that's really confusing, but just keep that in mind whenever you see a word and then there's something you think added to the end like this, meaning his in this case. Then we'll talk a little bit more about this once we get into the grammar more in depth. So for now, just kind of be aware of our words and again, just practicing and being familiar with our vowels and how they sound and how they work. So, and he said to him, Ani El Shaddai. Ani El Shaddai. So we have Ni El Shaddai. So Ani is the word for I, like the pronoun, me, I. So you can even introduce yourself as Ani, right? And in your name. Then we have El, which this is that form for God, right? And there's nothing added to it on the end, right? So it's just the word El with a sere. So that means it should be the word for God. And then Shaddai, Shaddai. And Shaddai is the word that's sometimes translated like mighty or almighty. And it's kind of like the word for Adonai, actually. This is technically my mighty or something like that. My greatness, my almost like my lords, right? So God, my lords, or it technically means like mountains, Shaddai, or Shad or Shadim. And interestingly, the Shadim or Shaddaim were in among the I think either Edomites or Moabites were basically what were called the mountain gods. And so again, this is kind of almost like taking over or co-opting the word from the nations for the word for God and basically saying, it's not just like your mountain gods, it's the greatest of the mountain gods, right? Kind of like with El, it's not just a, God, it's the greatest of El, right? The Elohim. Similar with Lord, it's not just, a Lord or an important Lord, which was oftentimes, given to or referred to the gods of the nations, but it's the greatest of the lords. And so this is a very common, pattern that we see, that the Lord, the God of Israel, is given this kind of special form, which means the greatest of all. And so here it's kind of the term that's used for, the mountain gods, but he is the greatest of all the mountain gods, above them all. He is unique. All right. So let's finish this up here with this last phrase. So we have hit chalek, le fanai, the ye tamim. Hit chalek lefanai the tamim. All right, so what do we have here? Well, we have this root word, halak, which we learned a while back in our hey form. And this hit part is kind of a unique special verb type that we'll talk about in the grammar some more later on. But it means basically to like go back and forth or just more indiscriminately. It's a little bit more open-ended. Rather than just like travel from point A to point B, it's sort of like to go back and forth or all around. So here it's basically like a command, walk around, right? Anywhere you go, right? Everywhere you go. Le, so that's that preposition, to, right? And then panai means literally my face or my faces. And so go before me or my face, and then of course that word meaning to be, haya. So and be tamim. And tamim is a unique and interesting word used in the sense of to like be blameless or pure. And so he's calling Abraham to walk before him, blameless and pure, in a similar way that was said of Noah, right? That Noah was a righteous and blameless man who walked with the Lord. And so this is one of those key features of the people that God works with, that chooses to covenant with, right? That they are people who walk blameless before the Lord. And I would even say it's blameless in the sense of not that they never make a mistake or that they are perfect, but that they are faithful, right? That they do trust in the Lord and obey his command. And so that was certainly true of Abraham, even though he had his ups and downs in his faith, and he did waver at times. But in the end, he did end up being proved faithful, that he did fear God. All right, well, let's talk briefly about Psalm 1, which again is such an amazing and great verse. So Psalm 1, verse 2. So we have here, ki im be Torat Adonai chefzo. Ki im be Torat Adonai chefzo. All right, so what do we have here? Well, ki'im is really two separate words, but when they're together like this, it kind of means something like rather than. Okay. Then we see betorat. So what does that be added to the front mean? Well, hopefully by now it's becoming very familiar. It means in, with, by, among, right? So rather than in the Torah, right? The instruction, the teachings, the guidance of Adonai, the Lord. And then chefzo. So O being his, and chefetz is delight or joy, his pleasure. So rather, his joy or his pleasure, his delight is in the law, the instruction, the guidance of the Lord, right? And so much like in Proverbs chapter 3, where it mentions that the Lord disciplines those whom he loves like a father to a son. And so if you're a son and you have a father who's loving and you love your father and vice versa, then you actually cherish his instruction and his law, his guidance, because you know that he cares about you, and that if he tells you something to do or not to do, it's because it's for your best interest. It's for the good of you and for others, right? And of course, that is so much more true of our perfectly wise and good God. And so the second half of this verse, we see, U, ve, to, ra, to. U vetorato. U vetorato. Yege. Yege. Yomam. Yomam. Va laila. Va laila. Va laila. So we have U vetorato. Yege. Yomam. Va laila. All right, so what do we have here? Well, we see, of course, as expected, the and on the front. And then we have the bet, meaning in, with, by, right? And here, perhaps on, actually. So again, that word is a little bit flexible when it comes to English. We have to kind of make it fit. And then we see that O in the sense of his. So and, in, or perhaps on, his Torah, Torat, his instruction, his guidance. Yege, he meditates, or it's actually kind of the word for like to mumble almost. So to like say. So in other words, he recites and repeats and considers and ruminates and marinates and meditates, right? Whatever combination of words you want to use. He is filled with God's word and God's instruction. Yomam valayla, daily and nightly, or every day and every night, or all day and all night. And this is actually kind of an interesting distinction in the Bible from some of the non-biblical world when it comes to meditation. A lot of times in the secular or kind of new age movement, a lot of these different traditions, the way you meditate is by emptying your mind, right? But when it comes to the Bible, meditation is actually filling your mind, but not with garbage. It's with the word, the instruction, the law, the guidance, the teaching of the Lord. In other words, scripture. Right? And so that's what it should be filling our minds, instead of trying to empty our minds, though, of course, sometimes it's good to just rest and take a break. But, in this kind of sense, we should be seeking to fill our minds when we meditate and memorize a verse, memorize a whole chapter of the Bible. Fill your mind with scripture. And that is one of the things that distinguishes, as we find out in Psalm 1, between the righteous and the wicked. The wicked don't care at all about God's instruction, but the righteous, the wise, the prudent man or woman, they fill their mind with the word of God at all times. It is their light. It's their lamp that guides them. And it is really, truly by the word of God that we live. So, a wonderful verse, both from Genesis 17 and Psalm 1. Well, let's go ahead and finish with one last go through the alphabet here. So let's do it together. We have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sadek, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, that is our lesson on the E type or E class of vowels. So I hope you learned something. I hope you'll share something, and I look forward to seeing you next time.